the Earth is so much more complex than we realize.
Yeah, and I think even that we're even have the capability of understanding.
Yeah.
You know, and that takes us back, and that takes us to, you know, some of the conversations that we've had that people think science is, you know, I've often referred to science as the other side of faith. You know, science gives us the how, but
how
not,
God
but
did
the,
it.
but not the why. But we only know so much about science, and we're still learning things every day. You know, and the whole science is conducted with scientists using the scientific method, and then usually when the scientific community with some things there's a consensus that, you know, gravity is real. Okay, we all can see that gravity is real. You can test the theories, and prove that it's real.
Incidentally, if you take a survey to see if there's a consensus on gravity, I think you would find a 100% consensus.
Yeah.
So this 97% consensus on climate change is mysterious if it's a proven fact.
See, you got to be careful about that, though, because there's also flat earthers out there, so there's not a consensus on whether or not the planet's even round or not. Now, I mean, real scientists know, but I mean, like the science, you know, you don't have to be a real scientist to be in the scientific community to challenge the scientific things that people come out with. That's why science is meant to be conducted openly, so that anybody who wants to challenge your assumption can, and that's how things in the science world works.
You know,
hi, I'm Mr. Science, and today we're
from a creationist point of view, I wonder if, like, God's purpose in circulating that carbon dioxide is because, like, plants in the ocean need that, and so, I mean, you know, and
that's
of course
plant
the fish need oxygenation.
Yeah, but plant life needs
life in the oceans would need
the carbon dioxide. Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing. We can't eliminate all the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere because then there would be no plant life.
Yeah. Now, Keith, let me ask you this thing. Okay, this question. Suppose our CO2 levels right now, I guess a lot of people believe they're around 400 parts per billion. Is it, or million? Million. Okay. So suppose the CO2 levels went up to about 600 parts per million. Would that be harmful to the Earth, or would that be beneficial, do you think?
It would have some harmful and some beneficial effects.
The plants would grow better.
Plants rely on carbon dioxide. Plants breathe in and out just like animals do, except they breathe in the carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. We do the opposite. We breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. If you go to a greenhouse, you'll find that the plants are growing very well inside the greenhouse. And the reason for that is they actually pump up the carbon dioxide levels in a greenhouse. It's about 1,000 parts per million, or 2.5 times the atmospheric level. And the plants grow much better there. There is a website, and I don't remember what it's called right offhand, that talks about or lists studies that have been done on various plant life and how they respond to elevated CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels. And you will find that if you would double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 300 to 600 parts per million, that's an old study when it was 300 parts per million. If you would increase it to 600 parts per million, you would get about a 30% increase in the yield of the staple crops, wheat, rice, corn, beans, and so on. You would get a much larger increase on some food sources. One of the best would be blackberries, which would increase their yield by about 1,700%. And blackberries happen to be one of the most nutritious foods that there is. So you would be getting a lot more nutrition out of the planted crops of the earth if you had higher carbon dioxide levels. Now, some plants don't do as well under increased carbon dioxide. And one example is a plant called Darwin's woolly butt, which actually doesn't like the higher carbon dioxide, and it doesn't do as well.
And what do we get from that plant, by the way?
Is it a weed?
Well, it's not a food source anyway.
Oh. So there you go. So there's a food, yeah, okay. Do you know, just out of curiosity, do you know of any legitimate food sources that we use that would not do better under a higher carbon dioxide level?
Not offhand. There probably are some.
There probably are some.
But there are some unwanted plants that do better under higher carbon dioxide, like poison ivy.
Okay.
That would increase if we increase the carbon dioxide level. So there are some negatives as well as some positives.
Yeah.
Now, Keith, I've heard and I've read numerous times. I remember. Well, I know one source that I could cite. That they're saying that carbon dioxide levels have been increasing, and based on satellite observation, the Earth has been getting greener as a result of increased carbon dioxide levels in recent years.
That's correct. One of the sources for measuring carbon dioxide levels in the past is the ice cores of the Antarctic. They can find bubbles that were trapped in the ice many, many years ago and do an analysis, a spectral analysis on those bubbles. And they can tell you that the carbon dioxide was lower back then and now it's higher. And the turning point where the carbon dioxide suddenly started going up was 1841. They can measure it with that much precision. That's within 1 or 2 years of 1841.
And that's long.
That's when we started getting more carbon dioxide in the air. That was before the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And we don't know why it suddenly started going up in that year. But that's when it happened. Now, is the Earth getting greener or less green because of that carbon dioxide? Well, we don't have a long history of that, but there is a satellite now that measures the verdance or the greenness of the planet. And what it is finding is that places that were desert many years ago are now being reclaimed by plant life, and the Earth is actually getting greener. And the satellites prove that.
But just like if there is temperature increases, even if they're natural and not man-made, some places are going to get greener, but then other places are likely to become more desert-like, or may also shift in their ecosystem.
Those shifts can occur, and there are many factors to that, and temperature is just one of them.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily like Texas right now. They're having serious droughts and stuff like that, but that's not necessarily to global warming and stuff. That's just because the planet's atmosphere and stuff shifts and changes.
Well, our worst drought was the Dust Bowl of the 1930s.
Yeah.
That was before major industrialization occurred.
Yeah. And again, before industrialization.
It's interesting. A few years ago, I guess it's about 10 years ago, my wife and I went to Alaska because it was our 10th wedding anniversary. And there was a state park in Alaska, and there's a big glacier. You can walk up to the glacier and, just look at it. And it's pretty cool. It's a big thing of ice.
Yeah.
And so as you walk closer and closer to the glacier, there are signposts that say where the glacier was each year. And this glacier has been shrinking, melting. And the oldest signs that are there were like in the 1830s. So that glacier has been melting since the 1830s.
Yeah.
I was there. I saw it. They have the year markers where the glacier was. Then it retreats so much, and then when it retreats more, they put another year post up there. So yeah, that glacier at that state park, it's been melting since the 1830s. Retreat.
There are approximately 100,000 glaciers on Earth, most of them very small. Very few of them are being measured, but of the ones that are being measured, most are retreating. Some are advancing. And the ones that are retreating, interestingly, as the glacier pulls back, it's revealing evidence of civilization that was thriving in some of those areas that are now covered with ice. you'll find evidence of fire pits and the foundation of huts and so on, which tells you that if you go back a couple of thousand years, some of those areas didn't have glaciers yet. The glaciers started advancing and driving the people out, and now they're going the other way and retreating.
Yeah.
So that's just a cycle that happens over long periods of time.
You know, Keith, I've heard that Greenland used to be warmer and it was green and they would farm there, and but now it's largely covered with ice. But then I've heard an alternative theory. No, they just called it that to try to attract people to go settle there.
Yes, I've heard it. That's what I was.
Yeah.
That's what I was.
So I
taught in
wonder
school.
which one of those is true.
That's interesting. I didn't even think about
I
that.
mean,
but
I've heard they actually did farm there at one time, though, and now there's not.
see,
much
what
of
I
that.
learned in school was that whoever discovered Iceland called it Iceland because he didn't want anybody else to come to his land. He wanted it for himself. And Greenland was called Greenland, even though it was covered in ice, because whoever found that wanted people to come to that island. That's what I learned in school, everybody. That's what they teach
The
you.
thing is, if Greenland was always covered with ice, then why would anybody want to live there? How could they survive without being able to grow any food? I mean, yeah. Okay, so now, so Keith, could you explain to us what a consensus is, and what role this perceived consensus, all the scientists, what role that plays in promoting the man-made global warming myth?
Let's see if we can get a consensus here. I say that pizza tastes good. How many agree?
I do.
Okay, we have a consensus. Pizza is good. Now, the consensus on climate is a little bit harder to measure. And what they claim is that there's a 97% consensus on the basics of global warming. What are the basics of global warming? Well, they don't really say right off the bat. Let me tell you how that 97% was determined. There was a student, a master's degree student, some years ago, who wanted to do a measure of the consensus on climate change. And so they looked for the biggest group of scientists that they could find. And what they came up with is they were going to survey the American Geophysical Society, I believe that's correct, AGS, which had 3,000 members. They were going to survey that group of 3,000 people. So they sent an email. It was a brief email with a couple of questions on it. And they got responses from 1,000 of the members. So right there you had a 67% consensus that this survey wasn't even worth your time to answer a couple of questions. But they looked at the 1,000 replies that they did get, and they didn't like what they were coming up with. So they said, okay, let's limit the survey to just those who have done substantial publishing in the area of climate in their recent publications. So they went from the 3,000 original group down to 1,000 that answered the survey, down to the select group that were climate scientists according to their limited definition. And that turned out to be, if I remember correctly, 79 people out of the 1,000, out of the 3,000. Of that 79 people, 77 of them were agreed on the questions in the survey, which comes out to 97.4%. That's the percentage that the 77 is out of 79. 97.4%. They rounded it up to 98%. And when they initially announced the result, they said there was a 98% consensus, which is violating one of the rules of math by rounding up instead of down.
Yeah.
But they corrected that, so they now say there's a 97% consensus. Well, what the survey asked basically is just two things. Is the Earth warmer now than it used to be? And the answer to that is yes, if you're looking at the last 200 years, for example.
Yeah.
And the second question was, has the human race contributed significantly to this warming? Well, the word significantly is a word that we use in general conversation, but it has a special meaning in science. And some were bothered by the fact that they didn't state what the significance level was supposed to be for that question. So even out of that small select group, there were two people that didn't go along with the consensus. But that 97% number has become ingrained in our conversation, and we now say that 97% of all scientists agree with the global warming hypothesis.
Yeah, so
which isn't accurate.
You know, I think I heard President Obama in one of his speeches say 97% of scientists say that we're causing global warming. Yeah, or 98%.
But that's
I
not.
remember hearing him say that.
Yeah, but it's not accurate.
True.
Yeah, no, it's not accurate.
90% of a very limited number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of not all scientists.
And depending on how you ask the question, too.
And the selection of those 79 people was based on their publishing history. And that creates some problems, too, because most of the scientific publications are committed to only allowing things to be published if they agree with the consensus. So it's the consensus that determines what's been published, not the published authors that can determine the consensus.
That's interesting too. It's a little backwards on that one. And again, it's all relative though. Is like even the 97%, even if all 97% of those scientists what you said 75 out of 77, even if those 75 people still think it's warmer or the Earth's warming up, again, it's all relative compared to when. In the last 200 years, yes. In the last 1,000 years, no. It seems to be getting colder, not warmer.
Yeah.
So
no. So a little earlier, you mentioned like people that are skeptics of global warming. People tend to launch ad hominem attacks. Can you explain to our viewers what an ad hominem attack is and some of the examples of the labels they would throw in?
Well, it's another debate trick. Ad hominem attack means name calling. And those of us who have any skepticism at all about global warming are called anti-science. Now, it's interesting that I'm anti-science because I have some doubts about global warming, but those that say that there are now, 67 genders?
Yeah.
Those are the scientific people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, it's true. The side who has always been pushing global warming and scientific fact is now the same side siding with people saying that there is no number of genders. It's limitless.
Yeah.
Okay? It's like, so they can accept science, which isn't even science when it comes to global warming, and they can't accept science when it comes to gender. Which is, obviously a real problem. But that's a whole other...
I see the same thing about people who are against forced vaccination of, like, for the COVID shot.
Yeah.
You're an anti-vaxxer. No, it's not necessarily you're an anti-vaxxer. You're just...
No,
a lot of us think there hasn't been enough time to do long-term safety studies.
I'm actually pro-vaccination. If I have kids, I'm going to get them their measles, mumps, and rubella shot, and I'm going to get them with some of the vaccinations that they should be getting. But this is not a vaccination that what they came out with for this COVID thing. There's been no time to study it or look at long-term effects. That's not a...
Why you anti-vaxxer?
Yeah.
You science denier.
Well, we've just been kicked off YouTube.
Yeah. It's just we have different, people have different views. Scientists differ.
Yeah.
Doctors even differ on various things. They have different points of view and they look at the data differently and reach different conclusions. So, yeah. Okay, so now, could you explain to us Dr. Michael E. Mann's hockey stick chart? This is a chart that Al Gore showed that he tried to use to prove that Earth's temperatures are increasing. So, Michael Mann's hockey stick chart, is it accurate? And so could you explain to us where he came up with that?
Okay, Michael Mann is the state climatologist for Pennsylvania, or at least he used to be, as well as a professor at Penn State. He's more a politician than a scientist, if you ask me. He was graphing temperatures from the past, for the past 1,000 years or so.
Is that what we're going to do right here? Is that what we're talking about right here, too? Sorry, everybody. I'm interrupting his conversation for a minute. So, okay.
Yeah, John's looking through the book here. There's a picture of Michael Mann's hockey stick. It's past you.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, what he came up with is a chart that shows the temperature, and I got to revert in my mind so it'll be right on the screen. Shows that the temperature was going down slowly until maybe 100 years ago, and then suddenly started rising rapidly.
Shaped like a hockey stick.
Which has the general shape of a hockey stick. Now, Michael Mann was on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. That's the UN agency, the IPCC. When they did their first general report, the chart of past temperatures in that first report showed that the temperature went way up during the medieval warm period, went down during the Little Ice Age, and is coming back up. It wasn't a hockey stick shape at all. In later versions of that report, and they issue a report, I think it's every 6 or 7 years, in later versions, they put the hockey stick in, showing the temperature going down, and then suddenly rising. So where did that chart come from? Well, it came from one type of proxy data, tree rings. And the tree rings seemed to show that the temperature was going down over the long term until they ran out of tree rings. And then they replaced the tree ring data with actual thermometer readings from the same region. And the thermometer readings seem to show the temperature going up. But that chart that goes down and then up is actually two charts pasted together, if you will. One showing tree ring data and the other showing thermometer data.
So that's why it's such an incline up then.
Right.
That's interesting. So, wait a minute. That's not even science, though, right? That's not even. You can't
tape two charts together and call it one chart.
Yeah, you can't take it readings from like the tree and then decide halfway through that you're going to switch the method of how you're.
That violates one of the most fundamental rules of science, which is you control all factors but one.
Yeah.
Here you're controlling all factors but two, and you're looking at one of them, and then you're looking at the other one.
Is that cherry picking the data?
You could say that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Now, Keith, here's another question, and I want to just make sure I understand this right. Okay, it used to be called global warming, but isn't it true that since Al Gore began his crusade and everything, that the global temperatures began to actually show they were going down? So global temperatures were going down a little bit for a number of years, so they quit calling it global warming because the data wasn't reflecting that. They changed it to climate change. Is that what happened?
That's about the size of it.
That's how I understand it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Can I interrupt just for a minute?
Absolutely, you can.
When we were talking about the beneficial effects of cold weather, and there are some, one of the interesting things about cold weather is that those tree rings get packed closer together, which makes for a harder wood, and that is very good for making musical instruments. That's why Stradivarius violins are considered the best musical instruments ever made, because they were made during the Little Ice Age when the tree rings were packed close together, when the wood was dense, and it gave a better sound.
Isn't that something?
I've learned something else new. That's very interesting. I did not know that at all either.
Yeah. I play the violin. man. I wish I had a Stradivarius.
Oh.
I don't have one.
I wish I had one. Not that I can play it, but I could get about $1 million for it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So now, do warmer temperatures cause a rise in CO2, or do increases in carbon dioxide cause a rise in global temperatures? Which is it? Are we getting more CO2 because it's getting warmer, or is it getting warmer causing more CO2?
Well, we're looking at Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, now. And he has this famous scene where he's riding on a cherry picker to look at this huge chart that he has on the wall. It's like 16 feet tall and 100 feet long. And they're going along this chart and showing the temperature and the CO2 level, and they seem to move in tandem. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. That's called correlation. And there is a correlation between CO2 and temperature. Now the question is, which is the cause and which is the effect? The fact that they're correlated doesn't mean that one is causing the other. It could even be, it just happens to fall that way randomly. But the correlation is good enough that we think probably one is causing the other. Now, if you look at the data from ice cores in Antarctica, that's one of the places that they can get both temperature and CO2 information out of the ice cores. And if you look at that data, they seem to be moving in tandem, except that they're not quite lined up vertically. So one is going up before the other, and one is going down before the other. And the way it works is that when the temperature rises, the CO2 will rise about 200 to 400 years later. So to say that CO2 rises are causing a temperature rise is to say that they are having an effect 200 years before they even exist, which is not possible scientifically. The only logical way to read that chart is to say that the temperature change causes the CO2 change. And there's good reason to think that that's the case, because we know that most of the CO2 on Earth is in the oceans. It's dissolved in water. And we know that cold water holds more CO2 than warm water does. So up near the Arctic and near the Antarctic, the CO2 levels in the water is going to be pretty constant because the temperature is about 0 degrees centigrade, about the freezing point. But in the tropics, if the water is warmer in the tropics, it will release more CO2 because it can't hold that CO2. So a rise in tropical temperatures will cause a rise in tropical CO2. And once the CO2 is in the air, it spreads out pretty evenly around the whole globe. So a warm tropical ocean will cause a rise in CO2 worldwide.
Now, Keith, there was an illustration about soda or soft drink or a Coke or Pepsi that kind of illustrates that. Could you explain that to our viewers?
Well, the bubbles in soda pop are carbon dioxide that's dissolved into the liquid. Now, if you take 2 bottles of Coke, or Dr. Pepper, I would prefer, if you don't mind. Do we have to pay a premium now for it?
No.
Okay.
But they're not a sponsor either, Dr. Pepper. But if you'd like to be one, reach out.
Take 2 bottles, put one in the fridge, let it get really cold, leave the other sitting out on the counter. Take 2 glasses, open the 2 bottles, start pouring the 2 bottles simultaneously. The warm one will release lots of bubbles, a lot of foam. The cold one will release some foam, but not nearly as much. That's because the cold soda can hold the carbon dioxide better than the warm one can. It's an experiment you can do at home.
Yeah, and it's a good one, and
it's not dangerous, so don't hesitate to do it at home.
Yeah, you should. The worst thing that's going to happen is if you drink the warm one, it's going to be flat before you finish it.
So in essence, then what I hear you're saying, Keith, is that on this planet, that's what happens to the oceans. When they get warmer, they release more carbon dioxide.
That's correct.
So the Earth getting warmer and the oceans warming can make the CO2 levels increase.
Causes the CO2 to increase. That's correct.
So that's one evidence that it could be temperature driving increased CO2.
Yeah, not the other way around.
Yeah, rather than increased CO2 and increasing temperature.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, in the Bible talks about an end time battle called the Battle of Armageddon, and it's going to be very harmful and destructive. Well, this man-made global warming thing, it's like a Thermageddon. That they're, oh no, the sky is falling, we're going to destroy this planet.
Yeah.
And it's sad to say that ideology is like affecting a lot of things that are happening in our country and in the world.
Yeah.
Like there's this war on fossil fuels. Why shouldn't we be burning fossil fuels? Oh, it's going to increase CO2 and
we just
that's
covered
bad for the planet. Yeah.
And we just covered that man's having a very little effect on the amount of CO2 in the planet. The fact that the temperature affects the CO2 level more than man does. Now that's a good. I'm glad you brought that up. I want to ask you a question, actually, Pastor Gavin. Could we destroy this planet if we wanted to? Being that we believe in God and God is the holder of all. He decides what can happen and what cannot happen.
Yeah, well,
of course, He may let us destroy the planet someday if that was His will. But if He doesn't want us to destroy this planet, no matter what we do, we're not destroying this planet, right?
Yeah. It could only happen if God would allow it. And I don't see that. Now, there is one place in the book of the Revelation where it mentions that the Lord will judge those who are destroying the earth. But, like, in what sense, to what degree? Like, we could never destroy the earth to make it disappear,
Yeah.
But if there were nuclear war but with multiple nations, that could destroy large portions of the earth.
Yeah.
But I don't see it in Scripture that mankind is going to destroy the world. It's just not in there.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of destruction caused by mankind's evil behavior. Like in the book of the Revelation, it describes wars. And Jesus said, what'll be some of the signs of His coming? Well, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. And in the book of the Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, some of that will involve war. And it also says there will be pestilence, which would be referred to, diseases and so forth. They would, kill a lot of the human population. But no, we really, if we said, hey, let's try to warm up the planet and heat it up because we want to, no, we can't micromanage the earth.
Can't. Yeah, it's impossible for us to micromanage the earth because it's just not in our capability. We don't have the technology. We don't even have the knowledge yet on how the earth operates. I mean, we're still discovering new species inside the oceans and stuff. There's still plenty of places inside the oceans that we've never even been able to explore or anything. So we don't know as much about the planet as we all like to think we do.
Another thing, Keith, let me run this by you. I read what some people call the iris effect. And they said, like, in the iris in your eye, your pupil will expand and contract. That's the iris is outside of the pupil. So if you're in a dark room, your iris will expand to let more light in through your pupil. If you're out in a bright sunny day, it'll contract. So it expands and contracts according to how you need it. Well, I've read that, like, when the Earth's temperature starts to get too cool, that high level clouds form to keep the sun in, and when it gets too cold, low level clouds form to reflect the light of the sun. I think that's the way it is. So that I guess at night the low level clouds hold the heat in. Mm-hmm. But if it gets too cold, then higher level clouds form
That's interesting. Yeah, that's what
like one type of cloud warms up the Earth, keeps the heat in. The other cloud reflects the light, and so it's like a self-adjusting mechanism that the Earth has. Have you ever heard about the
I think I've heard you mention that before.
Yeah, and I've read that in books that deal with climatology.
It makes sense that if the air is getting warmer, more water is going to evaporate, which means more clouds will form, which means that the clouds will block some of the sunlight, which means that'll have a cooling effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pretty simple feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Earth does that a lot. I mean, the Earth has mechanisms in place to heal itself and to keep it going.
Yeah, God's so much smarter than we are, and I can't help but believe that He designed fossil fuels for us as a blessing.
Yeah.
Okay, so when energy is abundant and it's cheap, it helps human life and civilization to thrive.
Yeah.
And you look at the United States during the Trump presidency, his first presidency.
Yeah. We're coming up on a second one.
Yeah, Lord willing. But his first presidency, he released the American people from, trying to stop and hinder the energy industry.
Yeah.
So we were pumping oil and natural gas and became energy independent, kept gas prices down at a reasonable level, and because supply was abundant. Well, now look what happens when the White House resident,
former Vice President Joe Biden.
Yeah, and his administration are pushing policies that restrict our ability to produce domestic energy.
Absolutely, and that does affect the gas prices. But I do think it's fair to mention that even when Trump was in office, not that he has control. The president doesn't control the Federal Reserve. Let's be clear about that too. But the Federal Reserve during the lockdowns were printing money, and now we're seeing the results. Some of the result. Not all of it is Biden and his bad policies, but I mean a lot of it is. But it's also due to inflation because the Fed was just printing money. So it is supply and demand, and it's the Federal Reserve just printing money, making the price go up on everything.
Yeah.
But
I was referring to one of President Biden's first acts was to
kill the pipeline.
Keystone XL pipeline. Yeah. But yet help Russia remove restrictions and sanctions against Russia completing their pipeline.
Yeah.
The Nord Stream, I think that's how you say it.
Yeah, that is
Nord
true.
Stream pipeline. And then there are like energy companies in the U.S. now. I heard Jen Psaki, she was saying, well, actually there are about 9,000 leases available, but our energy companies in the U.S. aren't pumping oil and so forth. And my understanding is, well, yeah, but that's because our energy producers are afraid that if they put all that money into drilling wells, then the Biden administration will shut them down. So they don't want to take the risk in losing that money. There's the climate, no pun intended, in our nation is like anti-domestic energy.
Yeah, and we should be making our own energy. We shouldn't be sending our money overseas.
Yeah, and with alternative energy and electric vehicles, I had no objection to if people want to make electric vehicles and people want to buy them. That's fine if there's a demand and a supply to that demand.
Yeah.
But what I object to is the government forcing that on people.
Yeah.
Let's if people want to do that, great, but why does the government have to twist our arm?
I object to their smugness, those who drive electric vehicles, because my question to them is, when you plug that electric car in, where's that power coming from?
Right. Fossil fuels.
It's coming from a petroleum-powered
power
plant.
Yeah, natural gas and oil power plants, everybody, and coal. So what do you think you're doing exactly? Because you should also look into your electric vehicle, how much megawatts per hour it actually takes to charge said vehicle, and then do some math and figure out how much oil or coal it takes to burn to make that much megawatts per hour. You will be surprised by the results of that equation.
Yeah. So see this.
You think you're saving something, but you're really
Right.
not. You're in fact, most of the electric cars require so much charge that if you actually break it down to the kilowatt hours, you're not. It's coming out almost even, whether you.
Yeah.
May I tell you a story about government interference?
Yeah, please. We're always
Mexico City was having a terrible problem with all the car exhaust in the air, and they decided that they were going to solve this situation by allowing cars that had an odd-numbered license plate to drive on odd-numbered days of the month, while even-numbered license plates would drive on even-numbered days of the month. And they reasoned that this will cut in half the amount of car exhaust going into the air on any given day. Well, it didn't work that way, because anybody in the city that could afford to get a second car would get a second car, make sure that they had one with an even and one with an odd license plate, and they'd continue to drive every day just like they used to. And so many people were doing this. And the second car had to be a used car and not a very good car, so it was putting out more exhaust.
Yep. It made it worse.
It ended up making the problem worse. And this is pretty much standard procedure when the government tries to control things that are going to make it worse.
Yeah, it's very true. The government's role is to protect our liberties and our freedom, not to make changes or micromanage anything like that. Yeah. And anybody who out there who wants to know how do you handle a carbon dioxide problem within your city, and I'm not a scientist here, but I'm going to jump out on a limb and say trees. Plant trees around your city. Would that not reduce the amount of carbon emissions from vehicles and stuff if there were more trees?
And let me make another suggestion. Anybody who wants to, send me $10 and I will hold my breath for 1 minute.
There you go.
Yeah, that will help.
In fact, all three of us are going to do that. You send us all $10. I will set the I'll set the page up, the GoFundMe page, and if you want, you can pay us each $10. And for every $10 we get, we'll hold our breaths for 1 minute. That's easy. I'll do that all day. I will spend a minute holding my breath and a minute breathing, and then a minute holding my breath and a minute breathing. So please, if there's people out there that want that, you can send me an email. Email me at jdboilingpoint@gmail.com. Not just for that, but for anything, any questions, comments, or maybe if you'd like to come on the podcast, make sure you send me an email, jdboilingpoint@gmail.com. That's how you can reach the podcast with any questions or concerns. We have lots of episodes coming up in the next couple of weeks. Tyler Solomon will be back on the podcast within the next 2 weeks. We're gonna have he's going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine and what's going to be happening about that. We are going to have Pastor Gavin on again to also talk about Russia and Ukraine and to talk about that from a biblical standpoint as opposed to just the worldview standpoint, if you're okay with that. I did not clear that with Pastor Gavin. I just mentioned it right now. So hopefully he will be good with that. Keith will definitely have back on in the next within the next month. We haven't decided on how often he's gonna be back yet to continue covering his book and talk about climate change, global warming. So look for those. New guests are going to be coming on in the next couple of weeks also. Plus, don't forget the other podcast for the entertainment, Mayhem Original. You can find that at Mayhem Media on Facebook, so you can go check that out. That's where all the entertainment episodes are now. That's where our Olympic coverage is. And even though the Olympics are over, the Paralympics are still going on, so look for an episode on the Paralympics coming up as well. Pastor Gavin, Senior Faith Correspondent. Keith Nonemaker, Senior Global Warming Correspondent. I am your host, JD. Marcus Frederiksen is going to play us out. That's the end. I'm not around, have you found? I'm always on you.